Just for being 5 minutes late, Jasmine Crockett was slammed with a $500 fine by a Texas judge, right in front of the entire courtroom. No chance to speak, no chance to explain. But the very next day, that same judge was brought down and faced 15 years in prison for systemic abuse of power. And from the moment one woman stood up against injustice, the entire Texas judicial system began to shake. So what really happened inside that silent courtroom? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courthouse in downtown Dallas wasn't just a building. It was a monument to fear, built brick by brick through decades of whispered warnings and buried complaints. Locals had a name for Courtroom 3B, Pearson's Pit. It was a place where young public defenders were chewed up and spit out, where first-time offenders walked in hopeful and walked out humiliated. Conversations happened only in murmurs. No one ever laughed. The only voice that mattered here belonged to Judge Harold Pearson, and everyone knew, once he took the bench, even the clock ticked quieter. It was 9:35 a.m. when the silence cracked open. The double oak doors creaked, then swung wide with authority. Jasmine Crockett stepped inside, her presence cutting through the stagnant air like a cold wind. Her heels clicked, not like a warning, but like a statement. She had arrived late, 5 minutes, because 15 minutes before, her secure phone line had rung with a red-tagged alert. Urgent call from House Oversight Committee. The report concerned allegations of systemic beatings in a private prison near Navarro County. Men screamed through walls while guards turned up the radio. She couldn't ignore it. She didn't. But in this room, explanations had no currency. The moment Jasmine Crockett crossed the threshold of Courtroom 3B, the tension in the air thickened like fog before a storm. Her entrance, though composed and respectful, was met not with the quiet professionalism of a fair judiciary, but with the icy silence of a place waiting to pounce. She was 5 minutes late. Just 5. Not enough to derail a docket, not enough to cause real disruption, but in this room, 5 minutes was the fuse Pearson had been waiting to light. From his perch above the courtroom, Judge Harold Pearson adjusted his glasses slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he's about to unleash something rehearsed. His eyes narrowed with a look that wasn't surprise. It was satisfaction. He had already decided who Jasmine Crockett was before she ever said a word. "I see punctuality isn't a concern for Washington royalty," Pearson said coldly, not addressing her, but declaring it to the room like a punchline meant to humiliate. His voice boomed with that unmistakable cadence of someone used to being obeyed, not questioned. He didn't give her a chance to respond. 5 minutes late may not mean much where you're from, but here it means disrespect. Then he turned directly to her, his expression flat, yet filled with disdain. "And I do not tolerate disrespect." The words echoed longer than they should have, as if the room itself recoiled. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Slow, measured, public. This wasn't a judge managing his courtroom. This was a man making an example of someone he didn't think belonged in front of him. Jasmine stepped forward, calm but assertive, her heels clicking once more as she stopped at the podium. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was pulled into a classified briefing regarding—" But she didn't get any further. Pearson slammed the gavel down with a ferocity that felt performative, theatrical, like a magician demanding silence before a trick. "Save your excuses," he barked, voice now dripping with contempt. "I don't care what imaginary emergency you think justifies this." Murmurs started in the gallery, then went dead silent. Jasmine blinked once, but didn't flinch. The insult was sharp, precise. He had just labeled a federal oversight call on human rights abuse as an imaginary emergency. Not out of ignorance, but out of deliberate disrespect, and everyone watching knew it. She tried again, slower this time, steadying her breath. This was a federal matter, prison conditions. "And this," he snapped, cutting her off again, "is a courtroom, not your press conference." His hand hovered over the gavel like a trigger finger. "You're 5 minutes late. I don't care if you were curing cancer. That's contempt." Then with a clang, the gavel struck wood again. $500 fine, payable immediately. or I will have the bailiff escort you out, and you can explain your classified briefing from a holding cell. The threat wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about order. It was about dominance, about power, about putting a black woman with status and credentials in her place. Pearson leaned back smugly, eyes scanning the courtroom as if daring anyone to object. No one moved. Not the attorneys, not the bailiffs, not even the clerk. It was the type of silence that came from long conditioning, from people who had watched too many others be punished for too little. Jasmine's face remained neutral, but inside something was boiling. She had seen this before. This exact moment 100 times when she was a public defender. The scolding, the dismissal, the performance of legal authority when the real goal was humiliation. Only this time, it was happening to her. And this time, cameras were watching. The unfairness wasn't just the fine, it was the complete refusal to listen. The mocking tone, the presumption of arrogance. Jasmine Crockett wasn't being treated like a member of Congress, or even like a citizen. She was being treated like an inconvenience, a problem, a warning to others. Pearson didn't want order, he wanted obedience. And he wanted the courtroom to see it happen in real time. He wanted the reporters in the back to write about her disgrace. He wanted the younger attorneys present to learn one thing. If he could slap down a congresswoman, he could slap down anyone. And yet Jasmine didn't yield. She didn't shout or beg. She stood with a stillness that came not from fear, but from the discipline of someone who had spent her entire career walking into rooms where the odds were never in her favor. She didn't just see Pearson's actions as rude. She saw them for what they were. The weaponization of the bench to punish presence, to punish voice, to punish a woman who dared walk in late, but not bowed. The gavel's echo had barely faded when Jasmine straightened her posture. She didn't flinch. She didn't so much as blink. While most people would have withered under the weight of public embarrassment, especially from a judge in his own courtroom, she did something that turned the air electric. She stood still. But it wasn't a silence of surrender. It was a silence of calculation. Her eyes didn't burn with fury. They narrowed with clarity. And as Judge Pearson leaned back in his chair, with the arrogance of a man convinced he'd won the room, he missed the quiet shift in power. Because Jasmine wasn't done. She had absorbed the blow, measured the damage, and now, with the calm of someone who had seen real injustice up close, she leaned forward just slightly, enough for her voice to land in every corner of the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, her tone even, "since we're speaking of decorum, I feel compelled to remind this court of Canon 3B5 in the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct." There was no bravado in her delivery, just surgical precision. It clearly states that a judge shall perform judicial duties without bias or prejudice. That includes bias based on race, gender, political affiliation, and yes, professional status. She let the words settle, not like dust, but like lead. Every syllable landed with the force of precedent. "You didn't ask me a question. You didn't allow me to explain. You issued a $500 fine without hearing cause. That is not maintaining order. That is retaliation." A breathless stillness overtook the room. Jasmine wasn't grandstanding. She was testifying, and not to a jury, but to history, to the very idea of justice that this courtroom was supposed to represent. Pearson sat motionless, but his eyes betrayed him. The lines on his face hardened. His jaw tensed. A single twitch in the corner of his mouth revealed that he had not expected her to fight back with law. He had expected nerves, maybe anger, but not cold, articulate defiance armed with judicial codes. "Are you alleging this court is biased, Congresswoman?" he asked, the word Congresswoman loaded with venom. Jasmine's reply came without hesitation. "I'm stating that this courtroom has a documented pattern of punitive overreach, and your reaction to a 5-minute delay only confirms it. Your record speaks loudly, Judge. I'm simply amplifying it." Behind her, someone shifted in their seat. It wasn't a restless move. It was the involuntary twitch of someone witnessing the exact moment the air changed. Pearson tried to regain footing. "You're skating dangerously close to contempt. Again." His voice was more cautious now, as if feeling the edge he'd been walking. Jasmine didn't move. "And you're skating dangerously close to a violation of your oath," she replied. "Canon 3B5 exists for a reason. It's to protect this courtroom from becoming an extension of a judge's personal resentment, from turning legal procedure into personal punishment." She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice cut sharper than any raised tone could. In the corner of the room, a young intern for the Dallas Public Defender's Office scribbled furiously into a notebook. It would be the most important note she'd ever taken in law school. Still, Pearson tried to hold his ground. "You're lecturing a judge about the law in his own courtroom?" Jasmine nodded. "When that judge forgets the law applies to him too." "Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing." A sharp inhale passed through the gallery. Not a gasp of outrage, one of release. Like the collective realization that someone had finally said what everyone else had been too afraid to. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a public servant or a woman defending herself. She became something else entirely. A mirror. And Pearson, for all his decades of experience, finally saw his own reflection, and it wasn't noble. It wasn't dignified. It was angry, petty, and now exposed. The room was still, so still it was as if even the air had stopped to listen. Judge Pearson sat high above, draped in the weight of his own authority, gripping the edges of his bench like a captain clinging to the helm of a ship he didn't yet realize was sinking. He had delivered his blow. He'd expected her to retreat, to shrink, maybe to protest with indignation or flustered excuses. But what came next wasn't a defense. It wasn't an outburst. It was an indictment, delivered with the controlled cadence of a seasoned litigator who knew exactly what she was doing and who she was dealing with. Jasmine Crockett stood steady, the very embodiment of restraint under fire, and spoke with a clarity that cut through every ounce of tension thickening the courtroom. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but edged with unshakable steel, "let me be unequivocal. I will pay the $500 fine today. I will not argue the penalty. I will not delay its resolution." She reached into her bag and removed a slim, labeled envelope, sealed and addressed to the clerk. The movement was simple, but in that moment, it had the impact of a declaration of war. Her fingers were precise, intentional. She placed it on the podium and slid it forward. "Here," she said plainly, "is my immediate compliance with your ruling. But understand this, my compliance is not agreement." She paused, eyes fixed on Pearson with unflinching resolve. "Because while I am willing to respect this court, I am not willing to tolerate its misuse. So along with this payment, I will be submitting a formal complaint to the Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct. And unlike your ruling, mine will be backed by evidence." Her voice didn't rise, but the force behind it filled the room like thunder rolling low before a storm. Pearson's face began to change, not with shock, but with that flicker of disbelief that crosses a man's face when the rules he's always bent begin to bend back. His grip tightened, his lips parted, searching for a retort, a warning, a dismissal, but none came, because she had left him no room. Jasmine leaned in just slightly, not as a show of aggression, but as if to narrow the space between truth and power. "I will not let your contempt for me become precedent for how others are treated in this room," she said, her words deliberate, like chiseled stone. "This court is not a personal arena. It is not a place where professional stature is used to provoke and judicial power used to punish. But today you tried both. And unfortunately for you, this time, someone is documenting it." There was no applause, no reaction from the courtroom. Just a silence so thick it became its own form of pressure. Even the bailiff looked downward, unsure whether he was witnessing a confrontation or a reckoning. Jasmine stood tall, eyes unwavering. "I've seen what happens when power goes unchecked. I saw it as a public defender in Dallas County. I saw it when teenagers were sentenced harshly for minor offenses. I saw it when mothers were silenced before they could explain why they missed court. And now I've seen it here, from you, cloaked in robes and rhetoric." Her hands remained calm at her sides, but her presence had grown, eclipsing even the bench. "You can wield your gavel, you can hide behind protocol, but you cannot shield yourself from review. Not anymore. Not in this era, Not in this state, and certainly not from me. She didn't blink. She didn't stutter. She let the silence hold, not as a pause, but as a statement, one louder than any shout, a message that resonated beyond the walls of that courtroom. Pearson sat back, robbed of his script, his rhythm, his control. And Jasmine? Jasmine had done what no contempt charge could ever silence. She had redefined the balance of power in the room, not through rebellion, through resolve, through law, through truth spoken without fear. And as she stepped back from the podium, envelope still resting quietly beside her, it became clear to everyone watching. The judge had tried to make her an example. Instead, she had become a precedent. But Jasmine didn't stop at a fine or a complaint. That was just the surface. What she said next shifted the entire energy of the courtroom, from a personal confrontation into the first strike of something far larger. Her voice still calm but now laced with something colder. Conviction sharpened by data, cut clean through the heavy air. "This isn't just about me," she said, eyes fixed on Judge Pearson, like a spotlight that refused to dim. "This is about a pattern, one that has gone unchecked far too long in this courtroom." She paused, letting the weight of that sentence hang. "So I'm not only filing a formal complaint, I will also be initiating a full-scale data review of your courtroom history. Motion denials, contempt citations, sentencing disparities, all of it." She stepped closer to the microphone, her tone now unshakable. "I've already assigned a legal research team. We'll be requesting transcripts, examining case outcomes, and identifying whether this courtroom has become less a place of justice and more a chamber of punishment." Pearson's expression twitched for the first time, tightening not out of rage, but calculation. He recognized the words for what they were, a roadmap to his undoing. Jasmine didn't flinch. "We will analyze your rulings for evidence of disproportionate sentencing, especially against younger defendants, public defenders, and minorities. We'll track how often objections are overruled, how often hearings are fast-tracked or denied without due process." Her tone wasn't speculative, it was prosecutorial. Because when judicial power becomes predictable in its bias, that's no longer discretion, that's systemic abuse, and it must be exposed. The gallery sat frozen. Even the court reporter had slowed her typing, her fingers visibly trembling as they caught every word like pieces of evidence. "I will bring the numbers," Jasmine continued, her voice a slow rising drumbeat, "and with them, the stories behind those numbers. The defendants humiliated for speaking out, the attorneys silenced for defending too hard, the single mothers who walked in for traffic tickets and walked out in handcuffs." Each example hit like a blow to the ribs, targeted, real, unforgettable. "And once the picture is complete, I will not just hand it to the commission," she said, narrowing her eyes. "I will place it into the hands of lawmakers, oversight boards, and every journalist in this state. We will make the invisible visible. We will make the quiet pain loud." Judge Pearson sat frozen, his fingers twitching slightly on the handle of his gavel, but he didn't raise it this time. The confidence that had radiated from him only moments ago now seemed to flicker like a dying bulb. His cheeks flushed, not from exertion, but from something far more dangerous for a man like him: surprise. For decades, he'd ruled from that bench like it was a throne, delivering sentences like edicts, challenging anyone who dared speak without trembling. But now confronted by a woman who not only stood her ground, but wielded the law better than most he'd ever faced, Pearson found himself exposed. He hadn't expected her to quote Canon 3b5. He hadn't expected her to come armed with not just facts but strategy. She hadn't shouted, hadn't postured, and somehow that made it worse. Jasmine had spoken with calm precision, and that precision hit harder than any outburst could have. And now, with the eyes of the room on him, Pearson realized something horrifying. He had nothing to say in return. He opened his mouth once, just a shallow intake of breath, as if he'd found the beginnings of a retort, but no sound followed. There were no legal loopholes to hide behind, no obscure court procedure to weaponize. The rules he had relied on for so long had just been turned against him, recited word for word by someone who knew them better. He glanced toward the clerk, then toward the gallery, but there was no rescue waiting, no ally in the crowd. Even his own bailiff looked like he didn't want to make eye contact. The courtroom had shifted. He could feel it. Where once he had commanded fear, now there was doubt. Jasmine hadn't just challenged his authority, she had cracked its foundation. And in that quiet, brutal moment, Judge Harold Pearson understood. He had picked the wrong person to make an example of. The judge's weak defense barely hung in the air before Jasmine stepped forward again. This time not to shield herself, but to shatter the illusion Pearson had so carefully built over decades. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years, hers and everyone else's, crushed beneath the gavel that sat so comfortably in his hand. "You say you apply the law equally," she said, tilting her head slightly, disbelief lining every word. "Then explain the string of young defendants you've held in contempt for speaking before you called on them. Explain why your harshest sentences are disproportionately handed to black and brown teenagers with public defenders who barely get a word in before being shut down." She turned slightly, addressing not just the judge now, but the entire room. "This courtroom has a reputation, and it's not for fairness. It's for fear, for humiliation, for reducing people into cautionary tales so you can perform dominance behind a bench." Reporters in the gallery were no longer just taking notes. They were capturing history. Jasmine continued, voice unwavering. "I've watched the footage. I've reviewed the transcripts. And what I've seen, what others have experienced, is not law. It's punishment disguised as process." She didn't speak for herself anymore. Her posture, her tone, her precision, everything radiated the presence of someone carrying the voices of thousands. "I'm not here because I was 5 minutes late. I'm here because I refuse to let this room treat me the way it treats so many others, silently, shamefully, and without recourse." Pearson's face twisted, his authority visibly cracking beneath the pressure. He reached for the only weapon he had left. "Representative Crockett, you are this close to another contempt charge," he growled, raising the gavel once more like it could silence her truth. But Jasmine didn't even blink. "Then do it," she said, staring straight through him. "Find me again. Add another number to the pile, because every unjust ruling you hand down today only proves the very case I'm building outside these walls." Her words didn't echo, they detonated. The courtroom, once his stage, now belonged to her. Pearson's threats, once ironclad, now clanged like hollow tin against the armor of someone who had already endured worse and had no intention of bowing again. The gavel never fell again. After Jasmine's final words carved through the silence like thunder through glass, Judge Pearson remained motionless, his authority unraveling one silent heartbeat at a time. And while he sat there, visibly stunned, another force had already begun moving in the shadows of his own courtroom. From the gallery's back rows, quiet hands slid into bags and blazer pockets, not out of nervousness, but with intention. Phones were lifted just below eye level, screens tilted to avoid detection, and record buttons pressed with fingers that shook not from fear, but from adrenaline. They had all heard rumors about Pearson's outbursts before, but this wasn't a rumor anymore. This was evidence, in real time, caught not on security footage but by witnesses, by people who had watched a black woman speak truth to unchecked power and not flinch when threatened with punishment. The first clip hit the internet before Jasmine even left the building. It wasn't fancy. It was shaky, vertical, and grainy, recorded from behind a pillar by a junior legal aide who had just started her clerkship the week before. But the audio was clear. You could hear Jasmine's voice, measured, grounded, as she said, "Then do it. Find me again." The clip lasted 23 seconds. That was all it took. Within 15 minutes, it was retweeted by a local civil rights watchdog account. Within the hour, it was on the feeds of law professors, journalists, and elected officials across the state. Legal scholars started quote tweeting it with full references to Canon 3B5, marveling at the precision of her response. Public defenders posted, "I've seen that courtroom ruin people. Today, it met its match." But the true explosion came when Black Twitter picked it up, not with rage but with pride, not with noise but with strategy. By the time Jasmine walked out of the courthouse steps, the hashtags had begun stacking. Pearson Pitfall trended within the hour, followed quickly by Justice Not Ego, Gavel Check, and Crockett and Corruption. Clips were being edited with overlays, her image standing firm, overlaid with historical quotes from Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. TikTok users synced her voice to orchestral drops. YouTube commentators started releasing breakdowns within hours. Let's talk about what just happened in Dallas today. Even the morning news anchors, typically slow to respond to courtroom stories, opened their broadcasts with her line. This isn't about me being 5 minutes late. This is about power being late to accountability. It wasn't just viral, it was volcanic, because Jasmine hadn't just spoken for herself. She had spoken for every voice silenced by decorum, every truth dismissed as too emotional, every protest called unprofessional. And now those voices were speaking back, loudly, clearly, and with millions listening. But while the internet rallied behind Jasmine and headlines echoed her defiance, deep inside the polished walls of the Dallas County Courthouse, Judge Harold Pearson reacted the only way a man drunk on unchecked authority could, by tightening his grip. The very next morning, a memo was issued under his name. All media personnel were to be barred from entering courtroom 3B without direct written authorization from his chambers. No exceptions. Cameras were banned outright. Reporters who had once occupied the back benches now found themselves stuck outside the courthouse doors, met by stoic deputies who recited new security policies like trained soldiers. Due to safety and decorum concerns, they said, handing out leaflets. But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't about safety, it was about silence. The courtroom was no longer a place for public scrutiny. It had become a bunker. Pearson didn't want transparency. He wanted containment. He ordered the installation of temporary security checkpoints just outside the courtroom, an unprecedented move that created bottlenecks every morning. People were patted down. Bags were searched twice. Defense attorneys who had practiced there for years suddenly found themselves questioned at the door, their court IDs scrutinized under cold eyes. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to suffocating. The gallery, once filled with quiet observers, was now half empty, reduced by intimidation. Clerks moved like shadows, heads low, voices hushed. Pearson's courtroom wasn't functioning. It was retreating. And at the center of it all sat the judge himself, robe crisp, gavel within reach, posture upright, but eyes constantly scanning the room like a man waiting for another ambush. He wasn't ruling with confidence anymore. He was ruling out of fear that someone might capture his next mistake. Then came the speech, unscheduled, unprompted, but unmistakably calculated. Midway through a routine arraignment, Pearson pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and cleared his throat with theatrical weight. "Before we proceed," he began, eyes drifting toward the bench camera that had quietly been covered days earlier, "let me remind all present that this is a court of law, not a television studio." The room fell still. He continued, voice sharp, each word dripping with condescension. "I will not allow this institution to be used as a platform for political spectacle. Recent events have been regrettable, misleading, and frankly, damaging to the integrity of this bench." No one moved. Even the defendant standing before him looked confused. Pearson's voice dropped lower. "This courtroom is not a playground for social agendas. It is not a prop for attention-seeking theatrics. The law does not bend to headlines." He never named Jasmine. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. Every attorney in the room, every public defender staring at the floor, every clerk typing a little slower than usual, they all knew. Pearson's words weren't meant to restore order. They were a warning, a declaration that the throne was still his, and anyone who tried to question that would be met not with introspection, but with fury. But the truth lingered in the silence that followed, because even as he swung the weight of his voice like a club, everyone could feel it. Judge Pearson wasn't speaking from strength. He was speaking from a corner, and in that moment, the man who had ruled his courtroom through fear for 3 decades was no longer feared. He was simply exposed, and worse, he knew it. They met under the flickering lights of a nearly empty diner on the edge of the Trinity River, far from cameras, far from court. Jasmine arrived first, sliding into the vinyl booth without fanfare, her coat still dusted with the chill of early evening. No aides, no press. Just her and a quiet determination sharpened by years in the legal trenches. 10 minutes later, a young woman in a worn gray blazer stepped through the door, eyes scanning the room before locking onto Jasmine with a cautious nod. Moments after that, a man in his early 30s, clean cut but visibly nervous, slipped in behind her, clutching a messenger bag like it contained state secrets. They didn't greet her with smiles. They greeted her with the heaviness of people who had been carrying truth too long with no one to give it to. Jasmine gestured silently toward the booth across from her. They sat. The man, Elias, the former judicial clerk, spoke first, voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd talk about this again," he said, unzipping his bag. "But after what you did in that courtroom, I knew it was time." He laid out 3 thick folders, each stamped with dates, docket numbers, internal notes, files he should have deleted when he resigned 2 years prior. "I started keeping track because I couldn't ignore the patterns anymore," he explained. "Pearson didn't just rule harshly, he ruled cruelly, and always with a smirk." Jasmine flipped open a folder and scanned the top sheet. 5 motion denials in a single week, none with written explanations, all filed by public defenders, all involving Black or Latino defendants. Her jaw clenched, not because she was surprised, but because the data now aligned perfectly with the testimonies she'd already heard. This wasn't anecdotal. This was systemic. Beside him, the attorney, Marissa, shifted forward, her eyes burning with quiet fire. "He humiliated me in open court the first week I started," she said, voice shaking but steady. "Told me I was too emotional to be taken seriously. Said that right after I advocated for a 19-year-old client who had been beaten during arrest. He didn't care. Denied the motion, made a joke, moved on like it was a traffic violation." She paused, hands clenched in her lap. "And that wasn't a bad day. That was every day." Jasmine's eyes didn't leave her. She didn't interrupt. She let the silence after Marissa's words breathe, because that silence was sacred. It was the air that followed years of being ignored, invalidated, shut down. It was the air that came before change. Elias slid another sheet across the table, an annotated spreadsheet he'd compiled during his time as clerk. Tracked over 200 cases across 18 months. Nearly 70% of motions submitted by court-appointed counsel were denied without a hearing. Over 80% of defendants who received contempt citations were under the age of 30. Nearly all were people of color. Jasmine stared at the numbers, her fingers tightening around the page. "Did anyone ever report this?" she asked. Marissa nodded bitterly. "I did. Twice. The first one was ignored. The second time, I got a meeting with the chief judge. He told me Pearson was just old school and that I needed to develop thicker skin." Jasmine's lips parted, but no words came. Just a long, low exhale. The kind of breath you take when fury sits just below the surface, but purpose holds it still. She gathered the folders gently, like they were evidence, because they were. "You've both done more than most people in your position would dare," she said quietly. "But this isn't the end. This is the start." Elias looked up, a flicker of hope finally visible in his tired eyes. "You really think it'll matter?" Jasmine nodded, her voice firm now. "I don't think. I know. Patterns don't lie. Documents don't forget. And when this reaches the right ears, it won't be me Pearson's afraid of anymore. It'll be the truth." Outside, the city moved on. Buses rumbled, lights changed, traffic flowed. But inside that diner, beneath the buzz of old neon and over cold cups of untouched coffee, a case was building, not just against a judge, but against a culture of impunity that had silenced too many for too long. And Jasmine, she had just begun to gather her arsenal. The lights in the studio were hot, unforgiving and sharp, casting crisp lines on Jasmine's face as she sat across from the anchor, in a chair that felt more like an interrogation seat than a guest spot. The cameras were already rolling when the producer silently signaled 3 fingers down to 1. Across from her sat a respected national journalist known for hardline political interviews, the kind of host who didn't flinch and didn't let guests dodge. But Jasmine didn't come to dodge. She came to clarify, to reclaim the narrative, to make sure that what happened in courtroom 3B wasn't twisted into some sensational soundbite about a politician challenging the rule of law. She straightened her posture, not with defiance but with purpose. every inch of her body projecting control, even as the fire behind her eyes began to build. "Congresswoman Crockett," the anchor began, his voice measured but pointed, "there are critics who say what you did in Judge Pearson's courtroom was political theater, that you disrespected the court, that you crossed a line. Are you at war with the judiciary?" The question hung in the air, ripe for misinterpretation, baited and dangerous. Jasmine didn't blink. "No," she said calmly, her voice even and unhurried. "I'm not at war with the court. I respect the judicial branch deeply. What I am challenging is the abuse that's allowed to fester inside it, unchecked, unspoken, and cloaked in the language of formality." The anchor sat back slightly, caught off guard by her clarity. "What happened to me isn't unique," she continued. "It's common. What's unique is that I had the knowledge and the courage and the public platform to speak it out loud." She leaned in, just slightly as the camera zoomed tighter. Her voice grew quieter, but somehow more commanding. "Let's be honest," she said. "If someone like me, an attorney, a former public defender, and now a sitting member of Congress, can be silenced, mocked, and punished for simply being 5 minutes late, for invoking the judicial code, for standing my ground respectfully, then what happens to the people who don't have a law degree, who don't have a suit, who walk into courtrooms every day already assumed guilty for how they look, where they live, or how they speak?" The studio went silent, even the floor crew pausing their movement. The anchor said nothing. He didn't have to. The weight of her words did the heavy lifting. Jasmine's voice remained composed, but a subtle tremor of emotion underscored her next words. Not weakness, but the residue of too many stories heard and too many lives dismissed. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I never have. I'm asking for fair treatment. For me and for the kid from South Dallas who was fined for speaking out of turn. For the young woman who was called emotional for defending her client. For the elderly black man who was mocked for not understanding legal jargon." She glanced briefly toward the camera, just a flick of her eyes, and in that moment, it felt like she was speaking directly to every viewer who had ever felt powerless in a courtroom. "I don't want to burn the system down," she added. "I want to fix it before it burns anyone else." The interview ended not with applause, but with silence. Thick, reverent silence. The anchor, known for his sharp rebuttals, simply said, "Thank you," and went off script. The segment aired uncut that night during prime time. No interruptions, no commercial break. Just Jasmine, framed in raw honesty, laying out the anatomy of judicial abuse with the clarity of someone who had lived both beneath the gavel and beside the law. By midnight, the clip had gone viral, again. But this time, it wasn't just activists reposting it. It was parents, teachers, former jurors, young lawyers, retired judges, people who had spent years swallowing the quiet knowledge that justice often bent, not toward truth, but toward power. And now one voice had finally said it out loud, on camera, under lights, and without fear. She had returned quietly, unnoticed by most. Jasmine Crockett didn't come with cameras this time. No entourage, no media team, not even a notepad in her hand. Just her presence, calm, observant, deliberate. She slipped into the rear pew of courtroom 3B like a shadow at dawn, the same courtroom that had nearly cracked under the weight of her defiance just 1 week earlier. Judge Pearson had taken special care to ensure things looked normal again. The lights were brighter, the bailiffs more alert, reporters were barred, cell phones were banned. But there were some things he couldn't sanitize, like the feeling in the room, that eerie, metallic tension that lingered just beneath the surface, like the breath you hold before something terrible happens. Jasmine knew that feeling, and on that particular morning, she felt it return the moment a 22-year-old defendant shuffled toward the bench. His name was Leon Vasquez, a community college student, clean record, charged with disorderly conduct after allegedly raising his voice during a traffic stop. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, shoulders stiff with the kind of fear only found in courtrooms like this one. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt, slightly too big for his frame, tucked awkwardly into khakis. His public defender stood beside him, a young man Jasmine didn't recognize, likely new, already nervous. Pearson glanced down at the paperwork, bored. "Leon Vasquez," he said flatly. Disorderly conduct, first offense. He didn't look up. Defense counsel, I assume you're requesting dismissal? The attorney cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution has failed to present any credible evidence. No body cam footage, no witness statements, and no formal police report detailing threatening behavior. Mr. Vasquez merely spoke in a raised tone when asked to step out of his vehicle, which he did comply with. We believe the charge. Pearson raised a hand. That was all it took. The attorney fell silent mid-sentence. You believe, Pearson repeated mockingly, finally raising his eyes. And how long have you been licensed, counsel? The lawyer stammered. 10 months, sir. Pearson leaned back, a smug smirk pulling at one corner of his mouth. 10 months. So naturally you assume you understand the threshold of disorderly conduct better than this court does. Jasmine felt it then, that tightening in her chest, the one she recognized all too well. She shifted forward slightly, her eyes locked onto Pearson's face. Leon remained still, head bowed. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, then thought better of it. But a moment later, as Pearson continued lecturing the young attorney, Leon's right hand began to rise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. A simple gesture, polite, measured. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just raised his hand, and Pearson snapped. You! He barked, slamming his gavel so hard the courtroom flinched. Put your hand down. Do not ever interrupt proceedings in my courtroom again. The sound rang out like a gunshot. Leon's hand froze midair before dropping in a panic, his face a mask of fear. The public defender turned to him, eyes wide, but before either could respond, Pearson leaned forward with venom in his voice. 30 days in county lockup, contempt of court. A silence fell so sharp it could have cut glass. Jasmine's breath caught. She looked around. No one moved. The clerk's fingers hovered over her keyboard, stunned. The bailiff blinked twice as if uncertain he'd heard correctly. Leon's mouth fell open. I didn't say anything, he whispered, barely audible. I was just... You were out of line, Pearson spat, and you'll have 30 days to reflect on what restraint looks like. Bailiff, take him. The young man didn't resist as the officer stepped forward and gently but firmly gripped his arm. His legs buckled slightly. Please, he said, voice cracking. Please, I didn't mean... Jasmine rose to her feet before she even realized it. She didn't speak, not yet, but she watched every movement, her eyes blazing as if burning every second into memory. The bailiff, seeing her, hesitated. Pearson noticed too. Their eyes met, but Jasmine said nothing. Not here, not now. Leon was led away, still trembling, as the public defender stood frozen, helpless. The courtroom door clicked shut behind him, but the sound echoed through the walls like a prison gate slamming. Pearson adjusted his robe. Next case, he said briskly, as if the past 10 minutes hadn't just rewritten a young man's life. Jasmine sat back down slowly, her heart thudding with the heavy rhythm of injustice laid bare. She didn't need a file folder. She didn't need a camera. She had just witnessed something so raw, so blatant, so cruel, it would speak for itself. And she knew in that moment, the tipping point had arrived. Word of Leon's sentence spread before the day was over. Though no cameras had recorded it, the whispers turned to posts, the posts to screenshots, and by that evening, multiple courtroom observers had shared what they'd seen. Guy got 30 days for raising his hand, someone tweeted. Pearson's courtroom is a trap, not a court. Screenshots of Jasmine sitting silently in the gallery went viral alongside grainy sketches and retellings. The hashtags surged again. Your Pearson pitfall, now joined by Raksh, Hands Not Crimes, and Haisha Free Leon. By midnight, over 60,000 people had signed a petition calling for Leon's immediate release and a formal review of Pearson's conduct. Civil rights attorneys began offering their services pro bono. Activists planned rallies. Local reporters scrambled to confirm the story. It wasn't just another outrage, it was a spark that lit something dormant. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an error in paperwork or a misapplied charge. This was punishment for posture, for presence, for the audacity of a young man thinking he could raise his hand to speak in a room where speaking was a privilege reserved only for those Pearson deemed worthy. And Jasmine? She was done waiting. That night in her private office, surrounded by stacks of documents and screenshots from whistleblowers, Jasmine dictated a new press statement to her chief of staff. Her voice was razor sharp. Today I watched a young man be sentenced to 30 days in jail for the crime of being respectful. She said, "This isn't law. This is intimidation masquerading as order. It is not my name that Pearson fears. It is accountability. And that fear is now justified." She paused, then added, "I will be filing an emergency motion to unseal and review all contempt citations from the last 3 years in courtroom 3B. I will be calling on the Judicial Ethics Commission to place Judge Pearson on immediate administrative leave, and I will be returning to court tomorrow, as an observer, as a witness, as a reminder that the people are watching," and they were. The next morning, the courthouse steps were crowded, not with protesters, but with people. Quiet, present, holding signs that read, "Silence isn't contempt," and "Justice doesn't fear a raised hand." Inside, Pearson entered with his usual flourish. But he didn't look up. He saw the gallery was full, but the faces weren't passive, were alert, ready. Jasmine sat again in the last pew, her arms folded, her expression unreadable, but her presence loud. He cleared his throat before starting the session, but his voice cracked once, barely noticeable. But Jasmine noticed, because the winds had changed, and now every word, every ruling, every raised gavel would be watched, documented, and, if needed, challenged. The era of silent obedience in courtroom 3B had ended, and with one hand raised in fear, an entire community had risen in power. And Jasmine wasn't just documenting injustice anymore. She was leading the charge to dismantle it, piece by piece, ruling by ruling, until justice no longer depended on silence, and fear was no longer a requirement for respect. The morning after Leon Vasquez was hauled away in handcuffs for the crime of raising his hand, something began to shift, not just inside Dallas, but far beyond it. Jasmine's silent presence in that courtroom had not gone unnoticed, and by the time the courthouse doors reopened, there was a fire burning in legal circles across the state. At first, it was just murmurs, a few direct messages between former public defenders, a private email chain between civil rights attorneys who had once stood at that same podium, cut off mid-sentence by Pearson's disdain. But those whispers became signatures, and those signatures became declarations. And soon a wave of outrage, measured, legal, and terrifying in its precision, was crashing toward the very seat Pearson once occupied like a throne. Within 72 hours, over 36 civil rights organizations had co-signed a joint statement condemning the judge's systematic erosion of due process and the disproportionate targeting of marginalized defendants. The Texas Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers issued a call to action, urging its members to submit any rulings they believed displayed bias or procedural abuse from Judge Pearson's bench. One email from a retired public defender read simply, "He sentenced my 17-year-old client to 90 days for speaking out of turn. I've kept quiet for 12 years. I won't anymore." Law professors began unearthing and dissecting Pearson's published rulings in real time, highlighting patterns so clear they no longer needed interpretation, they were evidence. Meanwhile, protesters continued to gather outside the courthouse. No longer a few passionate voices, but now hundreds. Faith leaders from local churches joined hands with organizers. Students from nearby colleges passed out pamphlets titled, "Know Your Rights in Court." Former defendants who once feared returning to that building now stood shoulder to shoulder, holding handmade signs. One read, "I raised my hand too." Another, more chilling, simply said, "Pearson gave me 30 days. I was 15 inches, and still the courthouse security watched quietly, some with crossed arms, others with lowered gazes, unable to deny that something irreversible was unfolding. Inside the legal system, the gears of accountability began to grind forward, slowly but undeniably. The State Bar of Texas launched a formal inquiry, citing multiple complaints against Pearson from practicing attorneys. The Judicial Ethics Review Committee quietly reopened a previously dismissed complaint from 2016. And then came the moment no one had expected, not so soon. The Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct, Under intense scrutiny and pressure from both public outrage and a flood of documented evidence, issued an emergency suspension order. Effective immediately, Judge Harold Pearson was removed from active duty pending the outcome of a formal ethics hearing. The order was cold, bureaucratic, written in the language of statutes and clauses. But to those who read between the lines, it was thunder. The summary stated that Pearson faced substantial allegations of repeated judicial misconduct, abuse of contempt powers, and demonstrable bias towards certain classes of defendants, and that continued service on the bench posed a risk to the fair administration of justice. He was given 48 hours to vacate his chambers. His docket was reassigned, his office phone was disabled, and the once mighty courtroom he ruled with fear, Courtroom 3B, stood still for the first time in over 3 decades. Pearson didn't issue a statement. He disappeared behind silence, issuing orders through his attorneys and refusing media requests. But silence did nothing to stop the tide. News anchors used phrases like, "a reckoning in real time." Editorial boards ran headlines like, "Justice finally holds the gavel." One local paper printed a front-page photo of the empty bench with a single caption, "Vacated." Meanwhile, Jasmine, who had received hundreds of emails, calls, and handwritten letters from people sharing their Pearson stories, remained focused. She wasn't interested in vindication. She was interested in reform. In her office, her staff worked day and night, building not just a file on Pearson, but a blueprint for structural change. She convened roundtable meetings with law professors, retired judges, public defenders, and victim advocates. Together, they began drafting legislation aimed at reforming judicial oversight at the state level. A bill that would not just punish bad judges, but prevent them from slipping through the cracks for years, even decades, while their misconduct ruined lives. It included mandatory bias training, a public database of contempt rulings, and independent civilian oversight of judicial conduct investigations. Jasmine called it the Courtroom Integrity and Accountability Act, CIAA, and made clear in every meeting. This was not about revenge. This was about protection, prevention, real justice. And yet, amid all the noise and movement, it was the quiet victories that struck the hardest. One morning, Jasmine opened an envelope that had been slid under her district office door overnight. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman who had once been jailed for contempt after requesting a translator in Pearson's courtroom. It read, "I didn't think anyone would ever say it out loud. Thank you for doing what we couldn't." Folded behind it was a faded docket sheet, her case number circled in red. The suspension of Judge Harold Pearson wasn't a conclusion, it was a rupture, a break in the wall. The first breach in a system that had long protected itself with formality and fear. And though he would eventually sit before an ethics tribunal, his gavel already stripped, his robe already meaningless, the deeper verdict had already been rendered, not by a judge, but by the people, in protests, in letters, in lawsuits waiting to be filed, and in the unyielding voice of one woman who chose not to be silenced, even when silence would have been safer. Jasmine never looked back. She didn't need to. The gavel had fallen, but this time it echoed on her terms. And the sound of justice finally rising was louder than anything Pearson had ever imagined. From the moment the ethics hearing was announced, the air around the Texas Judicial Review Board headquarters felt electric, charged with tension, expectation, and something long overdue. The case of Judge Harold Pearson wasn't just another misconduct hearing. It had become a symbol of reckoning. Metal detectors were stationed at every door. The public gallery filled to capacity within minutes. Reporters lined the sidewalk outside with satellite trucks and whispered updates through their earpieces. Inside, the hearing room was austere. No dramatic flourishes, no theatrics. Just a long oak table, a panel of 3 seasoned judicial commissioners, and rows of seats filled with witnesses prepared to unearth years of buried injustice. This was the day accountability would be given voice, and Jasmine Crockett, calm, composed, and unshaken, was first to the stand. She took her oath without hesitation, raised her right hand with steel in her gaze, then sat with quiet authority. The microphone before her didn't amplify anger. It amplified truth. "I am not here out of vengeance," she began, her voice firm but controlled. "I am here because I saw firsthand what happens when a courtroom becomes a stage for unchecked power, rather than a forum for justice. She detailed the contempt ruling leveled against her, not for misconduct, but for presence, for daring to stand tall, speak clearly, and question a judge's behavior in his own house of mirrors. She cited specific canon violations, especially 3B5, which bars prejudicial treatment based on race, gender, or professional status. What happened to me, she said, wasn't unique. It was a pattern, a habit, a culture built on silence. And I am here to break that silence for everyone who never had the platform to speak. The room remained still, the gravity of her testimony sinking into the walls. But Jasmine was just the beginning. One by one, the others followed. A former public defender named Marcus Reed, now graying at the temples, stood next. He called me boy in chambers. Twice, he said, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with buried rage. Once he threw my motion in the trash, literally into the trash can in front of my client, because he didn't like the way I argued. Then came Elena Torres, a former clerk whose eyes welled as she recounted how Pearson regularly joked about breaking new attorneys early. She handed the panel a sealed folder, handwritten notes she'd kept in secret for 3 years, time-stamped case summaries, dismissals with no rationale, orders written hours before hearings had even begun. The panel took them without a word, their faces growing darker with each passing page. But it was Leon Vasquez's testimony that brought the room to the brink. Now free on appeal and seated in a pressed shirt and borrowed tie, Leon took the stand slowly, hands visibly shaking. I raised my hand, he said, his voice raw. That's it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't yell. I didn't even speak. I raised my hand because I thought that's how you're supposed to show respect in court. And for that, I got 30 days. I lost my job. I missed school. My mother cried herself to sleep for a week. He stopped, breathing shallow. Then, I thought I did something wrong, but I didn't. He did. A hush fell so heavy that the air itself seemed to pause. One commissioner quietly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The silence wasn't just respectful, it was stunned. After hours of testimony, the panel recessed for deliberation, but no one left the building, not the press, not the witnesses, not Jasmine. They sat together, watching the sun slant through tall windows, waiting for a verdict that could not come soon enough. When the commissioners returned, their faces gave everything away. They didn't speak with flair or legalese. The chairwoman, Judge Elaine Navarro, read the decision with the grim certainty of a surgeon holding a diagnosis. We, the members of this ethics commission, having reviewed testimony, documentation, and first-hand accounts spanning over a decade, she said, find that Judge Harold Pearson engaged in a systemic pattern of judicial misconduct, willful abuse of contempt powers, and sustained violations of judicial ethics codes, specifically 3B4, 3B5, and 3B8. His conduct not only brought disrepute to the bench, but inflicted measurable harm upon defendants, counsel, and the integrity of this state's justice system. The room tensed. Accordingly, this panel recommends permanent removal from the judiciary, full revocation of pension and judicial privileges, and referral for criminal prosecution under Title 42, U.S. Code Section 1098-3 for the deprivation of civil rights under color of law. And then, after a pause so sharp it made the air crack, she added, we also support the prosecutor's recommendation for a 15-year prison sentence. The room did not erupt. It exhaled. Some wept. Some hugged. Some simply sat back, eyes wide, finally letting the enormity of the moment settle in. Jasmine didn't smile. She nodded once, closed her notebook, and stood with quiet dignity. Pearson, seated alone with his attorney at the far end of the hearing room, stared blankly forward, his face flushed but emotionless, like a man watching his empire sink inch by inch beneath him. For the first time, the gavel that had once been an extension of his voice was out of reach. He wasn't the authority anymore. He was the defendant. Justice didn't scream that day. It didn't shout. It whispered with power, and its echo, carried by every person in that room, was louder than anything Pearson had ever pronounced from the bench. Because justice finally had spoken, and this time it was heard. Pearson's conviction wasn't the finish line. For Jasmine Crockett, it was only the clearing of rubble, finally making room to build something better. The day after the ruling, she didn't rest. She didn't even pause. She walked straight into the Capitol, stepped into a hearing room still buzzing from the scandal, and dropped a 217-page bill on the desk with quiet finality. It was called the CAFE Act, Courtroom Accountability and Fairness Enforcement. But to Jasmine, it was more than legislation. It was a shield, a blueprint, a promise that no one else would have to face what she had faced, or what thousands of others had endured in silence. The proposal was as precise as it was revolutionary. Every courtroom in Texas would be required to maintain a public, searchable database of contempt rulings, motion denials, and judicial remarks, categorized by race, gender, age, and attorney status. Judges with disproportionate patterns would be flagged for review. An independent civilian oversight board would be created, made up of former public defenders, legal scholars, and everyday citizens. No more relying solely on bar associations or internal reviews that always seem to vanish in piles of paperwork. Every courtroom would be equipped with audio and visual recording systems, secure, tamper-proof, and stored in an open archive. Every defendant would have the right to request a written explanation for any judgment made against them. Transparency wasn't just a buzzword in Jasmine's bill. It was mandatory, measurable, and permanent. The bill met resistance, of course. Some judges called it an overreach. Some legislators called it too ambitious. But then came the hearings. One by one, survivors of Pearson's courtroom abuse, young men, mothers, attorneys, clerks, lined up to testify. They didn't scream. They didn't rant. They told the truth. Plain, measured, devastating, and every story stripped away another excuse. Jasmine's final speech before the vote was short but unforgettable. "We don't need perfect judges," she said. "We need accountable ones. We don't need courtrooms to be silent temples of fear. We need them to be spaces of clarity, fairness, and trust. If we cannot measure justice, we cannot protect it. And if we cannot protect it, we have already lost it." The chamber went quiet. Then the votes came in, and it passed. The CAFE Act cleared the House with a slim margin, then surged through the Senate after public pressure made inaction impossible. It was signed into law by the governor under a rainless sky, flanked by survivors, civil rights leaders, and a stone-faced Jasmine holding the final signed page like a verdict. Across the state, counties scrambled to meet the new transparency guidelines. Old courthouses got upgrades. Training programs were launched. Judges, some resistant, others quietly relieved, sat through workshops on bias, language, and procedural fairness. Texas, long criticized for its harshness, had just become a model of judicial oversight, and everyone knew it started with a single courtroom, a single judge, a single woman who refused to back down. And then something unexpected appeared. On the side of a legal aid building in South Dallas, an otherwise gray, forgotten wall, a mural was painted in bold, defiant color. Jasmine stood at the center, her body turned halfway toward a broken courthouse door. One hand held a scale of justice. The other was extended, not in anger, but in invitation. Around her, faint outlines of those who came before her, the silenced, the ignored, the punished, rose behind her like shadows transformed into witnesses. At her feet, painted in black lettering so sharp it looked carved into stone, were the final words she had whispered before leaving that courtroom for the last time. "Justice isn't earned in silence. It's demanded in presence." No one walked past that mural without stopping, and no one left unchanged. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.